They're twisting the text. They are trying to conceal its true meaning. We've heard, but their edits are shallow. The truth will out someday.
Peace of the Lord to all of you. Welcome to the show. So, most people would be familiar with a debate that happened a little while ago between David Wood and Robert Spencer. And one of the topics that was discussed at length was around the very embarrassing stories that we find in the Hadith, particularly about the Prophet, that was on the topic of did Muhammad exist or not. So some interesting things happened as a result, and I thought it was a time to challenge the understanding that we have of those stories for a simple reason. So during that debate, which if you haven't watched, you should watch it, is absolutely phenomenal, and a link will be in the description. Then something like this happened. They do talk for quite a while about many embarrassing stories about the Prophet. So they don't dispute that those stories are embarrassing to us, but they conclude something very different. David concludes that those embarrassing stories prove that Muhammad did exist, because why would they write them down otherwise? And Robert says there are these embarrassing stories, but they were not embarrassing to them. They are embarrassing to us, but to them, we're just missing the point. They would have seen these stories as having a different moral. For example, the satanic verses. So if they have the revelation about Muhammad revealing the satanic verses, then Allah removes that. So the moral of the story would be that Allah protects the Prophet and so on. But probably you've noticed that we do have the stories, the embarrassing stories, and there seems to be more to that story. Why are there so many stories in there? After all, they are not only stories about the character of Muhammad. There are stories about the Quran being partially eaten by a goat or a sheep, depending on the hadith. Many of the verses being lost because the guys who memorized it had died in battle, and so on. The stories just make the whole tradition look very bad. So we couldn't just stop at, hey, all of these stories about Muhammad were okay. So let me just play a few of the stuff that they said, just a few minutes, that um, from both the participants in this debate, so that you can see a little bit the approach that they took. Let's actually begin with David Wood.
It makes perfect sense for someone to invent a religion. That sort of thing happens all the time. It makes perfect sense for someone to make up a prophet or a religious figure to be the centerpiece of their religion. That sort of thing happens. But if you're inventing a religion and inventing the last and greatest prophet of your religion, there are certain kinds of things that you're going to make up, depending on what your goals are. What are your goals? And then you make up stories to go along with those goals. If you want people to believe this prophet is from God, you might make up miracle stories or stories of angels coming and helping out and so on. If you want your religion to be a force that unites you while you conquer the world, you would make up, commands to violently subjugate the world and to take captives and so on. So it's easy to understand why someone would make those kinds of things up. But if you're inventing a new religion and you're inventing the last and greatest prophet for your new religion, you're not going to invent stories that make your hero look stupid or insane or unreliable or evil or cowardly or possessed. In other words, you'll invent things that help your case for your new prophet. You're not going to invent things that hurt your case for your new prophet. This means that if we open up the Muslim sources and we find lots of stories that make Muhammad look stupid and insane and unreliable and evil and cowardly and possessed, the best explanation for why we have all these stories is that, like it or not, these things really happen. And if these things really happen, then Muhammad obviously existed.
Right. So that is all very reasonable and great, because that's the way that we actually think. we look at the sources, there are lots and lots of things that people would really try to hide, and they didn't. Therefore, there is validity to those stories. They represent a real person. Okay, there is a huge problem with that assumption, as we are going to see. But first, let's actually listen the argument from Robert Spencer, where he's countering particularly the claims about these embarrassing stories.
Obviously, indeed, you're not going to make up stories that make your hero look stupid or insane or unreliable or cowardly, but that all depends upon your point of view. We have to have a little bit of what Shakespeare called negative capability, the ability to enter into the mindset of people who looked at the world in a drastically different way. And so, for example, if Muhammad was suicidal, but Gabriel saves him from suicide, the point is not, gee, Muhammad was such an unstable personality that he was suicidal. The point for the people who were fabricating the story was that Allah is going to protect the Prophet in all cases, and no matter what. When you have the encounter and he thinks that it was a demon, and then his wife takes him to his wife's uncle, and he convinces him that it was Gabriel, this is to rule out that it was a demon that is appearing to Muhammad, and to show the Arabs of the time he's not actually poet or possessed. He's really a prophet. We already covered those possibilities and ruled them out. You have the same thing with the revelation from the devil, the famous satanic verses incident, that if Muhammad can get a revelation from Satan and that it's cast out, that takes care of several things. One is, it accounts for contradictions within this literature when they're bringing it all together. It explains why the material doesn't cohere, because some of it is from doubtful or even demonic sources. But Allah always protects the revelation. And that's the important takeaway point for the people of the time that this was being put together.
Right. So, once again, as well, a very reasonable thing to assume. There are stories that one can justify very easily as to why they are in the narrative. For example, about, say, Hassan. There is this story about the Prophet calling for Hassan, the little boy, and then suckling his tongue. It's like, okay, so why would that be there? One could argue that at one point there is a caliph who has some very, very disturbing views, and he wants to justify that. So he would just create a story with the Prophet doing it, and just like that, it becomes canon, and it becomes even desirable, because you have to act like the Prophet did. So one could argue that, and like Robert said, there are all these stories that you could justify. But if you are going through all of these stories trying to justify them, at one point you are going to get bored. There is going to be just too much to justify. For example, who would make a story about the Prophet going into the grave with, I think it was Ali's mother or auntie, I think it was auntie. Like, really, was there a caliph who wanted to justify that? Really, it starts to become a little bit weird. Or about the camel urine and stuff. There are some very hard things to justify. So today, I'm going to try and put forward a different explanation as to why these embarrassing stories are in their traditions. At the beginning, it's going to feel a bit far-fetched, but once we see a map later on, you will think like, oh boy, maybe that's what happened. Now it starts to make sense. So make sure that you don't switch off the moment that I say, how about this for an explanation? You need to see the map. Without the map, it will not make sense, but we're going to get there in a minute. And if it's the first time to the channel, by the way, make sure that you subscribe. We have a lot of stuff coming out early next year, and you certainly don't want to miss those things. So let's then try to tackle this problem and see what we find. Their argument then goes a little something like this. I will try not to strawman the position too much, but you will get the gist of it. So the Ahadith, particularly the Ahadith, let's ignore the Sirah and everything else. The Ahadith are full of embarrassing stories. That is a fact. Then we think that people at that time, they would want their prophet to look really good, right? That is very reasonable. And that the stories are still very embarrassing. So the conclusion from David is, therefore, Muhammad did exist and he was horrible, right? So this would be a little bit of like the thought process. However, there is a huge assumption here, and that is what we are going to challenge. That is that the early hadith transmitters and the early sheikhs wanted Muhammad to look good. Think about it. We have zero evidence that they wanted him to look good. In fact, all of the evidence points at those early guys wanted Muhammad to look bad. And of course, we have a problem. Why would they want him to look bad? It's their guy. But look at the sources. The sources say otherwise. Hmm? So this is the thing, the assumption that we are going to challenge today. The conclusion that he existed because people would want him to look good and the stories are not good is going to feel a little bit thin, hopefully in a little while. And that is what we call the principle of embarrassment, which we're going to challenge. Then the same argument from Robert, very similar. The Ahadith are full of embarrassing stories and nobody challenges that. So the guys who wrote those things, they would have wanted Muhammad to look good. Then the conclusion would be, hang on a minute, that means that those stories, even though we perceive them as being embarrassing, they were not embarrassing. As you can see, it would be both speakers arguing or trying to interpret an actual fact, which is the stories are full of embarrassing hadiths and so on. And they try to, one of them tries to explain it, saying that that confirms Muhammad. The other one tries to address it by dismissing the claim and saying the principle of embarrassment doesn't apply because these things would not have been embarrassing. But oh boy, yes, there are so many things that are embarrassing. Now, let's actually try to unpack the arguments and see if we find a flaw with this based on what we know of the Islamic history. So, the one thing that we know, the Ahadith are full of embarrassing stories. We all agree on that. So let's have a look at then the claim that the reason that they are there is because he existed and basically they had to write down what Muhammad was doing. Whether it was nice or not nice, they had to write it down, right? Okay, that is absolutely insane. That cannot be true. And if you disagree, let me know in the comment section below why. Because look at this. First of all, we do know that there are plenty of lies in their sources. We have them from the Quran, which is pretty much what is happening on this channel. We have it in their hadiths, we have it in the Sirah. They had no problem making up stories about Muhammad. That we know for a fact. The other thing that we know for sure is that they were very good at destroying evidence. Even to this day, wherever they go, they would destroy anything that was there before. Bibles were destroyed for hundreds of years, hence why we don't have Bible until like the 9th century written in Arabic. So they were very good at destroying stuff and they were very good at making stuff up. So if they wanted the prophet to look good, they would have made him look good. And if he had done bad things, they would have censored all of that information. Certainly, like they did that en masse. So there must be another reason as to why those stories are there. Another thing that happens is that if the person they described in the traditions, the Muhammad they describe, was that guy, no one would have followed him. We would not have the Quran, we would not have the Hadiths, nothing would have been in there. Think about this for a minute. You go to the sources and the descriptions are horrible, right? That means everyone who was there at the time would have known that this guy was horrible. And after he dies, nobody would have even said his name ever again. It would have been gone. Good riddance, horrible ruler or whatever. If he was described in the traditions in that manner, they would not have followed him. We know in the traditions, they then say, well, he became very successful when he went to Medina, and then he starts paying people to go and assault caravans. All of that is nonsense. It's just to make him, to create the story of how people started to follow him. But even according to their traditions, when he was preaching, no one followed him. Then when he started assaulting caravans, people started to follow him. The story of him would not have been as a prophet, because as a prophet, no one believed in him. So I want you to think about the following. Ponder on this. First of all, don't you think it's just a little bit convenient, a little bit too convenient, that we are in the 21st century and all that the Christian apologists need to do in order to make Muslims leave Islam is to show them their sources? Just think about this. They don't need to engage in an actual religious debate. All that they have to do is show them hadiths and say, look what the Prophet did, look what he didn't do, look what Aisha said, and so on. Isn't that a little bit too convenient that really all they need in order to dismantle Islam is to read their sources back at them? And the whole modern Islam has developed in such a manner that they have to keep every single Muslim away from their sources. The whole job of the Dawagandist is to make sure that Muslims don't read their sources, right? Isn't that convenient? It looks almost like a gift from out of time, from 1,000 years ago, from people giving the Christian apologists everything that they need in order to get Muslims out of Islam. So that's something to think about. The second point to think about is that if their sources were correct, which of course they aren't, we are exploring that in a sec, but if they were correct, Christian apologists read that and they conclude, okay, most obvious false prophet in human history. What we learn from that is that everyone during the time of Muhammad would have known that he was a false prophet, right? It's not like these people were just very, very stupid and they didn't realize. Also, their sources are full of stories that confirm that these people didn't think that this guy was a prophet. When Aisha said to Muhammad, "Oh, your Lord hastens to fulfill your every desire." What do you think that is in the Hadith? That is Aisha saying to the Prophet that he's faking it, right? So we even have that in their sources. People didn't believe in him. There is another hadith where the prophet is about to die and he asks for a piece of parchment and quill so that he would write some commands and then people will never go astray. And Umar saying, nah, we don't need it. We already have the Quran. Who cares? Those sources are not just embarrassing, and they are also not telling a true story. It's actually telling us what the character of these people actually was, according to their sources. Now, we're going to speak about that in a minute so that we can compare that with Christianity, and then you can see exactly what I mean. But for now, let's just ponder on that. Everybody would have known he was a false prophet, so the moment he dies, the stories would have disappeared. No one would ever speak about him. Therefore, every evidence that we have, which are all of the hadiths, point at one thing, that these guys who wrote these stories, they wanted Muhammad to look bad. I know it is very counterintuitive. What Muslim would want Muhammad to look bad? But that's what the sources say. Otherwise, they would have removed those stories to not make him look bad. So let's see what else we find. So let's talk about the hero's journey by comparing Christianity with Islam. During this segment, ignore all religious beliefs and let's look at the stories, as if it was simply a movie. So when we look at Christianity, we have the characters shown in the stories, and Jesus doesn't write the gospel, the apostles write the gospels. And we are told in those stories what those people do. We know that they are sacrificial, again, according to the story. They are sacrificial, they go to their deaths whilst proclaiming the good news. They don't do it for money and glory and women, quite the opposite. They are hardworking, devout, and something that we might describe them as quite extraordinary individuals. When you read the stories of the apostles, you would get the feeling that you can trust them with your life. Despite of them failing, is part of the hero's journey. When we have Peter, um, basically just failing in his belief, it is part of his hero's journey. He's described as a character, and you see how he grows from the moment that he's introduced all the way up to his death, right? They are described as people you can trust. Now, when we look at Islam, it's very different. We have the prophet doesn't write the book, just like in the case of Jesus, just because they copied the story from there, but that's a different matter. But look at the Sahaba. They are described in their traditions as people that cannot be trusted. The moment the prophet dies, they start just fighting for control and dominion. These people are warlords. They rape women. They enslaved full populations. They cannot be trusted according to their sources. Now, if you think that they can be trusted when they are doing everything that they do for power, for money, women, and all of those things, then you do you. Based on how they are described, I think they simply could not be trusted, which actually then makes us think what happened before. The prophet, if he was giving this revelation, which of course didn't happen, he would be saying stories that everybody had heard. We've seen stories that they are Talmudic stories. They are Jewish legends in the Quran. There are Christian legends in the Quran. There are stories people would be familiar with because they were, in theory, merchants, which is insane. But they would know all of these stories already. And then Muhammad appears and he starts saying the same thing and mostly wrong. And the guys around him think that he's a prophet? Of course not. They would have known that he's just saying what everybody already knows. He's making things up. So the moment that the prophet is gone, you would have counsel between the people who are going to inherit the kingdom. So Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and all of those people. And the only reasonable thing that could happen is those people saying, oh, good riddance. He's now gone. We don't have to try to memorize this thing that for some reason he wants us to memorize and whatever. They would forget about him and they would move on with their lives. That's the only thing these people would conclude, because according to the sources, Muhammad was a very obvious false prophet. No one would follow him. But what we get is something different. Everybody keeps pushing the story forward. That makes no sense. Unless these very untrustworthy future caliphs, they sit down and they think, hey, we really hated that guy. He was just saying a lot of nonsense. But you know what? He was very good for recruitment. So if we keep telling people that he was the last prophet, we are going to get some gullible Christians and gullible Jews to join our ranks. That would be the only way in which these people keep pushing the myth of Muhammad. according to the sources, everybody would have known that he was a false prophet. Yet we keep moving on and we see that they really believed in him. So, why all of these different stories? Well, let's see what happens and look at the map. Why are all of those embarrassing stories? Could it be because Muhammad existed? Could it be because they were not embarrassing at all? Or could it be that they wanted Muhammad to look bad? This is a map. I apologize for my lack of, creative skills, but this is approximately the map of the caliphate in the early 8th century. So still during the Umayyads, this would be the whole region. Now, Ibn Ishaq, the one who we've been told put together all of those stories about Muhammad, although then they were just pretty much destroyed, most of them, he was in this general region. In the region, apparently, I think he was born, according to the traditions, in Mecca or Medina, probably Mecca, and then he goes to Kufa, and then he's traveling around. But look at this, and this is the 8th century. The next map, we're going to see Christendom, and you're going to notice how most of this land was Christian just before Islam, just 100 years prior. So this is Christendom. This is a very conservative map because we know that Christianity had actually spread more here in Africa and here, North Europe, and all the way to China. But these are the main, say, countries where it is now a main religion, as opposed to just having a few people here and there or missionaries still doing their work. The first thing to note is, yes, I have included the Arabian Peninsula. If you look at any maps online, they are going to remove this. This is not going to be marked as Christian. Quite the opposite. They will say that it is pagan. And the reason is, well, because the Quran says so and because the traditions say so. But this is not true. I recommend people follow Gabriel Reynolds and his channel. He actually gets some scholars who study this, and they will confirm that more and more evidence appears indicating that this was no longer pagan. Sure, there would have been pagans everywhere, but there wouldn't be big communities, not like it is described in the traditions. In fact, the pagans were pretty much gone 200 years before Islam. However, all of these lands had been Judaized and then Christianized. So we have found like a church right here. We know that Najran was like a Christian hub as well, like a big one. And we know that the Southern Kingdom had actually been Christianized as well. So all of this would have been Christian. And 100 years later, that is just about going to be replaced with a new force. This one. Now, think about this. That early on, there is no traditions for Islam. First of all, when these warlords, they start conquering all of this land, they don't just go and unalive everyone and say, here you go. Now this is what you do and this is what you believe. No, most people would be untouched. They would still need the farmers and they would need the resources of the ground. So they would unalive as few people as possible, all things considered, just to keep people to obey the new rulers, and that's that. Now, the people in these lands, they would have been Judeo-Christian. Let's just go now with Christians because it would have been mostly Christians. Those people had traditions. They had vigils, they had liturgies, they had churches. They had a huge history, generation after generation, of being Christians. And then a new caliph appears and he says, now you're going to worship me. You can see how that would be a bit problematic. People would not just convert to Islam because why? At that point, they don't have anything. The book cannot be read until the 10th century. so it hasn't even been canonized. The traditions haven't been written. The stories really change a lot in the first 500 years, and then they continue changing. They don't have traditions. We know that they copied their traditions from Jews and Christians, and they just rebrand them and make them Islamic. But at this point, they conquer all of those lands very quickly. All of those people are still Jews and Christians. They have been so for many generations. In order for them to really accept and believe something different, you would need to have a lot of time with them. You would need to have a lot of evidence. At that point, Islam did not have it at all. Those people were Christians before, and they continue to be Christians for generations, which then begs the question, why are there so many embarrassing stories about Muhammad? Because they were written by Jews and Christians. I think that should be a hypothesis that should be explored. Because imagine you live in these lands and the Caliph now wants you to worship him. If you're a Christian, you're going to continue being a Christian. But what are you going to do? What would you do? Would you just say, no, Jesus is Lord and I don't like you? Then you get unalived and your whole family is taken into slavery. Would you do that? If you would, well done you. I would follow a different approach. I would go full ninja. I would just keep my beliefs at home, but then in public, I will just say, yeah, the Caliph is the greatest man. He's the successor on earth from God himself. He's phenomenal. I would infiltrate the ranks, and then I would try to demolish the belief from within. How I would do that? Creating stories. I would make sure that people in the future would not be able to follow the beliefs of these caliphs. I would make them look very, very bad. You see what I'm saying? You probably would have done something different, maybe, but I would have done that. And actually, the stories are so embarrassing, maybe because they were simply written by Jews and Christians. Most of them, then at that point, pretending to be incredibly loyal to the Caliph, but they didn't care about the Caliph. On paper, they would be the most hardcore Muslims ever, but in reality, think about them as spies. That would explain why the early sources are making Muhammad look so bad. And then the later sources, they are trying to make him look good. They give him miracles and stuff, but not the early ones. Now, could you pull that off? Yes. And it would have been remarkably easy to do so. First of all, because most of the people are on your side. Okay? The people who are loyal to the Caliph because of religion is just about nobody. Most people would still have their old beliefs, and they would continue to do that in private and with their friends, and they would act out a different persona simply so that the Caliph doesn't get upset. But think about this. So in this region as well, in all of this region, you would have different people occupying the lands. You would have the peasants. They are most likely going to be pretty much untouched whenever possible because you need the resources. So they are going to continue paying their taxes. Before they were paying to one guy, now they're paying to another guy. No worries. Then you will have the soldiers. Now, the armies, they don't care about religion. Very early on, they are not doing it because of religion. They are doing it because they are soldiers. They go, they conquer land, they get war booty, and so on. That's what they do. Also, they don't care about religion. And then you have the upper class. Those people who speak multiple languages and can read and write would be, for the most part, Christians and Jews. And you cannot just unalive them because you need them to run the empire. The administrative jobs have been done by them before, and they are going to continue. You can impose Arabic on them, but they will still have their own beliefs and so on. So you cannot go from very Christian lands to very Islamic ones when they don't have the traditions in just 100 years. All that you can do is threaten them with a sword. Now, also notice how the Islamic Empire became something very similar to the old Persian Empire. The Caliph became God on earth, or rather God's representative on earth, which is what the word Caliph means. Successor, first successor of God, then successor of Muhammad, and you have to worship the Caliph. That's actually what happened in actuality. It's exactly the same as it was with the Persians, where the ruler was being worshipped as God. Islam, what seems to do is exactly the same principle, but they have the Judeo-Christian view instead. They just take as much as possible from the Judeo-Christian traditions, and then they make you worship the Caliph just like the Persians had done by saying he is the successor on earth. Now, how would I do this? Well, oh, by the way, and then the upper class, or rather the intellectual elite, who are the ones who write things down and stuff, those people can get away with anything because they are the intelligent ones. Their IQs are probably, 50 points above everybody else. They can tell any story and they can get away with it. Let me give you some examples. Let's have a look at this hadith, for instance. This is exactly what I would do if I had been one of these guys who was a Christian or a Jew, and then I'm forced to worship Caliph. I would not have been able to write down, hey, the Caliph is making me fabricate stories about a guy who didn't exist. If I had done that, I would have been unalived and that writing would have been destroyed. So my only option is to leave little hints here and there to tell people that this fabrication was not something to be followed. So this is the hadith, one of the hadiths where Muhammad goes to the cave of Hira and Gabriel appears to him. But look what it actually says when we actually read it through this new lens. So he goes to the cave of Hira. Suddenly, the truth descended upon him. Remember, this is a Judeo-Christian, it had been Judeo-Christian lands for a really long time. The moment someone heard the truth descended upon him, they would think, okay, that's Jesus. They're saying the truth descended on this guy. Then immediately after, the angel came to him and asked him to read. And he's like, okay, the angel, yeah, that is as well one of the titles for Jesus. That's fine. This is talking about Jesus. And then look what happens. The angel is choking him. Any Christian would think, oh, we have a problem here. This is not something that Jesus would do also. Why did he not introduce himself? Why didn't he say, this is me? You know? Like when he met Paul, right? Why this character change? And then I would reinforce this in this manner. The prophet then goes running away, saying to his wife, cover me, cover me. He's like, really? Yes, very nice. But look what happens once we actually get to the end. So he goes, he has no idea about any of this. He goes to Waraka. And Waraka says, this is the same one who keeps the secrets whom Allah had sent to Moses. In brackets, they have added in the translation Gabriel, but Gabriel is not in the hadith. So people would have read that the truth descended upon him, then that thing is doing something that Jesus wouldn't do. Then Muhammad is looking really bad. And then Waraka is saying, without mentioning a name, is the same angel that appeared to Moses. Any Christian would know that it's the angel of the Lord and it is Jesus. It would be my only card available to play for people to realize that they shouldn't follow this guy. And there are plenty of other examples that we could have. The one that Robert Spencer said. So with the satanic verses. So you create a very embarrassing story. And if you keep the story as being very embarrassing, you are going to get unalived soon. So at the end, you just tell them that the moral is different. by saying, like Robert said, the story is embarrassing, but the point of the story is that Allah protected him. It's like, no. If someone has an IQ that comes back negative, they would believe that when they're told this in the 10th century, perhaps, that, oh, okay, you see, so our prophet was very good. Everybody else around, they would understand, no, this story is very embarrassing, and the Satan did not actually do these things with anybody else. This is telling us that this is not true. The same, you can create a story and see if you can get away with it. You say, oh, Ali comes to Muhammad and says, oh, my auntie or whatever has passed away and she was not a believer. And then the prophet goes into the grave and something happens. And obviously people would look at you like, what are you doing? Did the prophet really do that? So how do you say fix it? Then you say, no, that's because he was so nice and kind. And you have to really contain your laughter when you are telling that story to people, right? This is the thing, that when you have these embarrassing stories, they are embarrassing. That's why they try to get the moral of the story out of it. And that's the two different points of view. They are embarrassing. They were always embarrassing. They tried to fix it. But most of that fixing is not the fixing, it's just to ensure that the guy who is telling these stories keeps breathing. And certainly they can get away with it. Now, credit where credit is due. It was our friend Shai who has been on the channel a number of times. He hasn't been around for a while because he's been very, very busy. Hopefully, we will have him back early next year, and he can keep showing us more apocryphal stories that were borrowed into the Quran. But one of the first times that I spoke with him, he told me, "Did you know that there is a thesis that the Quran and the traditions were written by Christians and Jews under duress? That's why there are so many problems with the text." And that was an eye opener. He said that I was not aware of a thesis that went like that, but it really did make me think. And actually, he said that's probably why there are some sentences in the Quran that any Christian or Jew would immediately know this is not revelation. For example, the Quran says at one point, "Oh Mary, sister of Aaron." Now, that is obviously nonsense. The Quran puts Mary and Jesus at the time of Moses, or Moses at the time of Jesus. There is that big problem, and we know it's a problem. Hence why a hadith is created later to correct that mistake, saying, oh no, it was a nice thing to call Mary. It's like, no, it's just simply wrong, right? So when I had this conversation with Shai, he said, well, think about it. If you are working with these guys and doing this, say, under duress, if you write down something like that, if that's narrated to any Jew or Christian, they will know that it's not revelation from God. They would immediately know. Obviously, the people who were previously Zoroastrians or things like that, or even the caliphs, they wouldn't necessarily know, but the Jews and Christians would immediately know they are lying to you. The Quran is full of those things. The whole historical acronyms that they are in the wrong period. This is something that the Jews and Christians would have realized about crucifixion not being around during the time of Moses. Maybe they would have known that one, maybe not, but certainly they would have known that the Bible never talks about crucifixion in the time of Moses. They certainly would have known that. So when the Quran talks about crucifixion at the time of Moses, they know there is a problem. So it sounds like, wow, how could that work? Well, let's just look at the evidence. The evidence really is making a very strong case for everything to have been written by people who did not like Muhammad very much and who did not believe in the Quran and the canonization and so on. Other examples that would really work. So imagine you are supposed to do a tafsir in this Quran, but you're a Jew or a Christian, you are just pretending. But your parents were Christians or Jews, and your grandparents, and so on. So, but now you have to fake your allegiance to this movement. They are telling you to create something that is not there. So you're going to create as many problems as you possibly can. And you come across a verse that uses a word that is zayd, which means increase in Arabic, or rather the rasam means increase. And immediately after, there is a verse that talks about adoption not being allowed, right? So if you are smart enough, you can say that it doesn't say increase, it is the name of someone called Zayd. And then you create the whole story about adoption. So adoption was made illegal by God because of what happened immediately after, meaning that person was adopted. And you are making everything, basically, you can build a whole story, which would be very embarrassing, like the story of Zayd and Zainab. And when people ask you, hey, hang on a minute, where are you getting this from? You can just make it up. Say, yeah, I've got this narration, of course. You can have your buddies to come and says, yeah, I confirm. Haven't you heard this story? Come on, these people would be the intelligent ones, the ones that can read and write. They certainly could make up stories that make the whole thing look very, very bad. And certainly all of this seems to happen until we get to Ibn Kathir. And obviously Ibn Kathir has been written into a corner. So he makes many, many mistakes because of everything that had come before. But anyway, so let's have a look at a few other things. But do let me know in the comment section below. What do you think about all of this? Do you think that it is possible that when they tried to convert huge amounts of the population, when they still had no traditions, they couldn't radicalize people, they couldn't read the book, would they have really joined that religion when they were Christians and Jews after many generations of those traditions? Do you think that these people could have just been responsible for making Muhammad look very, very bad on purpose and getting away with it by, trying to say that that's the moral of the story? It's the equivalent of people with very intelligent people taking the piss out of people who are not very intelligent. So let me know your comments in the comment section below, and let's see what else. So Muhammad didn't exist. Every single time that we look at evidence, it just indicates more and more problems with the whole narrative. And in order to put him in the stories, we need to just justify. We have to twist the evidence in front of our eyes to make him fit, such as the stories are embarrassing. Well, that means that he existed. It's like, no, if those stories were true, he would not have had any followers. People would have forgotten about him. Now, so how do we go about proving that he did not exist? We have two different types of sources. We have the internal sources and then the external sources. This is going to be a very, very quick chat about these two things. And if you want us to delve into any of these in a lot of detail, let me know. I'll probably just do some of them. I really like the account of John of Damascus, so maybe that will happen soon. So internal sources. So we have things like the hadiths and the Sira and so on. Those internal sources, we know that we don't have any early manuscripts. They all come much, much later. And that's fine for any haters out there who think, hey, but there was oral tradition, people remember things. It's like, yeah, fine. I know that in history, we don't have the original sources for many stuff in antiquity or late antiquity. Normally we have copies of copies of copies of copies on oral tradition. I know that. This is just making the claim that we have to rely on things that we cannot prove, such as oral tradition or manuscripts we don't have, as it normally happens in history. But we don't have any of those manuscripts. If we had a manuscript from the 7th century that has lots of the hadiths that would be pretty much game over. It is very early, but we don't have them. So you have to go to the 12th, 13th, 14th century, have a look at those manuscripts and say, oral tradition, trust me, bro. So we don't have the definite proof that they were early. We have to trust people who is very well established they are untrustworthy. The second problem or thing to consider is the whole oral tradition. Now, I'm going to go on a tangent a little bit. Oral tradition is cope. So oral tradition is a real thing, but the way that they use it in order to justify the Islamic stories is absolute nonsense. Those things didn't happen. Oral tradition works a little something like this. If I tell you a story and then you ask me in a year's time, I will tell you the same story again. But guess what? I'm going to use very different words. I'm going to change quite a few things in the story because memory changes is one thing that happens a lot. Also, if then you go and you tell the story to somebody else, you are going to change things. So very quickly, a story really morphs into something completely different. Now, something that you can do is there are stories that originated, for example, in one country about an epic hero. And then that story spreads out to different countries. And if you pick up the stories that then they are written hundreds of years later, you can see that how they had the same story. And then in China, they made it all about some Chinese character. And then in Europe, you have that sort of similar story about some European guy. So the stories morph and they change, but maybe you can see that they had a common ancestor. But this is not what happens with Islam. When you go to the hadiths, transmitted from one guy to another is absolute cope. Of course, if you don't believe me, ask yes, Kadi. But it's just not how it works. For example, if you have Jewish people, they will gather around during Sabbath and then tell the stories of old, like Exodus and about King David and so on. They will say the same stories again and again and again and again. And that story cannot move because it is canonized and so on. But they are telling very long stories, epic stories, where a character goes through his hero's journey and so on. But when you go to the Hadith, what you see a lot is it was narrated by this guy who got it from this guy and this guy and this guy on the authority of this guy that the prophet split the moon. It's like that's not how oral tradition works at all. That's just a big no-no. So, but fine, they're very happy with the oral tradition. The problem is that the oral tradition, or how we have it in the hadiths, is a little bit of what would have happened. People really tell a story generation after generation. But when they conclude this one is true story because we trust the chain of narration, when you don't know any of those guys, it's absolutely insane. We know it is just a fabrication in order to justify the story. And then when you really, really have to justify a story, you create the same story from different people and say, you see, it's like, but the story could have been false to begin with. And also, all of the stories going back to the Sahaba and the Prophet, when everybody in that line would have been Judeo-Christian, as established, we know there is zero credibility with that. But the problem comes when we look at the stories within the hadiths that we know are fabricated. For example, the moon split. No one talks about the moon split outside of the Islamic traditions until hundreds of years later. We know it is a late fabrication. There are no witnesses. You can actually destroy it in a million different ways. The night journey of Muhammad. The Masjid al-Aqsa was not even built during the time associated with Muhammad. It was many decades later. The whole thing about Jibril. Jibril gets superimposed to the Holy Spirit probably around the 9th century, if not later. The Quran keeps talking about the Holy Spirit, and it is the Holy Spirit. And then they just replace that and says, no, the Holy Spirit is Gabriel. That thing appears much, much later. So we know that they create a ridiculous amount of hadiths to justify their beliefs. And then we look at the very negative stories and we conclude, oh no, that's because that was Muhammad. It's like, no, the obvious answer should be they are all fabrications And then we have to contend with the fact that some of them make him look good, some of them make him look bad, and trying to understand why there are these two very different types of stories. I think that would make much more sense than anything else. Now, but the problem with this, just to go in a little bit more of detail, is that they say that the oral tradition applies to the Quran. I mean, that is weapons grade nonsense. That never happened. It is silly on a whole different dimension, a whole different level. The other day, if you guys watched the debate between the apostate prophet and Junior, at one point Junior said, you know, I know that the Quran is preserved because I memorized it and my family memorized it and the people before them memorized it. But what about the Bible? How many people have memorized the Bible? And I just wanted the apostate prophet to say, dude, do you know why they didn't memorize the book? Because it's a book. It is implied that you don't need to memorize it because you write it down is the whole point. And when you write something down, people cannot move it about. When we look at the Qira'at, we know they couldn't read the Rasam, hence why it changes. It changes a lot. They couldn't read it. So how could they even memorize it? Imagine their traditions are what we've been told, which it wasn't, it's nonsense. But imagine that you're around in the 8th century and you spent your life memorizing one narration of the Quran. That disappears very soon. The book has not been canonized. You might have spent your whole life memorizing the thing and making other people memorize it, and is one of the Qira'at that is now gone because it didn't make the final cut. So the whole thing, when they say people memorize the Quran, it's insane for so many reasons. Number one, do you know what you need in order to memorize a book? You need the book. That's the key thing to remember. You are not going to just be going to the mosque and memorize a book because you have that imam in front of you telling you again and again and again until you memorize 6,000 verses. It's nonsense. You would much rather learn how to read and write the whole thing and keep it at home. You would not memorize the final revelation from God. It is insanity. You need the book in order to memorize the book. And once you have the book, you don't memorize the book because you already have the book. Now, would there be people, particularly in ancient times, who memorized the Bible? Of course, few monks here and there because they would be zealots. In Islam, the same. You would have had some people early on memorizing this, but it cannot happen before the 10th century. The book keeps on moving until, well, it moves after as well, but at least until the 10th century, you cannot begin to memorize it, and to memorize it en masse happens later. So another thing as well to consider is that when sorry, just actually left my mind for a second. These people back in the day, they would not have been able to retain any information about the Quran. The maximum that you could hope the population en masse to do is to memorize one surah. And by one surah, I mean Al-Fatiha. That's it. They are not going to get to Al-Baqarah. Like that is insane. It's not going to happen. They would just get it wrong. You know this, if ex-Muslims who memorized the Quran when they were Muslims and now they're ex-Muslims, they will have forgotten a lot. The human memory is really bad. You have to keep repeating the thing when you have better things to do. Like, for example, go and plant some crops. So when they associate the Quran, or they say it is preserved because of oral tradition, then we look at the Qira'at, not preserved. We look at the traditions, Ashib ate some verses. Why people didn't write it down? You're saying that people memorized it? What happened with the Shia books? The Shias, they say that they used to have a Quran, which is like supposed to be 95% the same Quran that we have, but with some changes. It shouldn't have been that difficult. Not a single Shia scholar remembered the Shia version. I could be wrong. You can tell me if there is a Shia book, but I think the belief is that the Shias did not retain their book, so they still follow the Quran while saying, well, it's a little bit corrupt because it was all about Ali. Trust me, bro. So, oral tradition, when it comes to the Quran, is absolutely insanity. It cannot be done, not until the 10th century. Also, it's worth mentioning you see how Muslims are now and how they were in the first 5 centuries of Islam. They would have been very different, just like I have explained before. Now, and one of the reasons why something that has happened over the last 1,000 years is they have gotten very good at removing Muslims' free will. And in order to do that, they implemented things, perhaps by chance, but it has worked out incredibly well, which is making them do more and more repetition and rites. When you do that, you become basically a robot. So they would make you try to memorize the Quran. It's pretty much by force. They will tell you, oh, because you will get a reward. But now you're just going to spend your life trying to memorize something which is actually pointless. You're going to be saying, peace be upon him, every single time that you say the name of a prophet. You're going to use a particular hand to do one thing, another hand to do another thing. You're going to step into a room with one foot or not the other, or whatever it is. You're going to grow your beard or cover yourself with the hijab. It's a repetition. You are just obeying instructions, which are arbitrary, but you don't know they are arbitrary. But you keep doing it because you've been told, go, pray in this manner, do this, do this, do this. After a while, you are now a robot. You will not be able to think freely. You will only be able to obey. That has improved over the last 1,000 years until the point we are at now. For the first few hundred years, those things were not available. People would think freely. So the people who are particularly the elite, the intellectual elite, they would have known this thing is nonsense. So they would have kept adding stories and stories and stories which are very damaging, and they would have been getting away with it. So you would have two different realms of reality. On the one hand, you have people trying to make Islam look as bad as possible. On the other one, you have people who are actually being radicalized. And well, here we are. But anyway, so oral tradition, absolute nonsense. Hadith stories, we know there are lots of fabrications. Why do we conclude that some of them are true? It makes no sense. So external sources. So external sources are interesting. Here is just one screenshot of the Doctrina Jacobi video where it is actually read out loud in case by a beautiful AI voice. So make sure that you watch it if you want to know about this source or others that we have here on the channel. So the external sources, they don't describe Muhammad's beliefs, character, and so on, right? So that's interesting. Let's actually explain a little bit with Christianity and the difference between Christianity and Islam. So with Christianity, the external sources would be Jewish sources or Roman sources, and you don't expect them to explain anything about Jesus or even the apostles. The most that you can hope to get from those external sources is people saying, hey, there is a bunch of guys there, they call themselves the Way. I don't know, they're weird, they're saying some crazy stuff. Something very small. You would not expect them to tell you the story of what was happening, just to tell you that there was something going on. And then if you want to know what happened, then you go to the home team and they will tell you what happened. That is with Christianity. The same applies with Islam. The best that you can hope for from external sources is, hey, there is something going on there in Arab lands. I don't know. Yeah. And then if you want to know what happens, then you go to the early Muslims who will tell you what happened. The difference is what I've said before. Even according to the story, people who transmitted, they were trustworthy. According to the Islamic sources, the ones that transmitted the Islamic sources, the Islamic stories, they were untrustworthy. Hence why a hadith is created later when they ask Muhammad, who are the best generation of Muslims or something like that? And he said the first generation will be the best generation ever. See how they try to fix it? To say the rightly guided caliphs, they were trustworthy. You look at the sources, they are just unaliving each other, fighting with one another. The whole thing is a mess. See? So anyway, from the external sources, we are not expecting to find a lot of detail, just something very small. The problem is that they do contradict Islam. Another thing is, yes, that on the one hand, they don't describe Muhammad as we know him at all. And the other one is that they don't really help confirm the narrative at all. So, couple of examples very quickly. We have these ones on the channel, so you can actually read this for yourself, but just to make a point. And if you want us to discuss those in more detail, let me know in the comment section below. And if you're not subscribed by now, please make sure that you do so. It will help us a bunch. So thank you very much. Let's carry on. Sebeos. This is telling the story of Jews from Edessa who were expelled by Heraclius. And then this thing happened. So those Jews expelled from Edessa, departed, taking the road through the desert to the lands of the Tayaye, to the sons of Ishmael. So the Tayaye from there. So the Jews called the Arabs to their aid and familiarized them with the relationship they had through the books of the Old Testament, blah, 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 blah. In that period, a certain one of them, a man of the sons of Ishmael named Muhammad, a merchant, became prominent. A sermon about the way of truth, supposedly at God's command, was revealed to them, and he taught them to recognize the God of Abraham. Oh, wow. There you go. J. Smith is wrong. Robert Spencer is wrong. Here we have it. Muhammad is a merchant. He became prominent. He talked to them and they followed him. That's it. Muhammad did exist. 1 second. The story, the actual origins story described here is very different. These lands here is meant to be in Iraq. These are the region of the Lahmets. Why would this Muhammad be appearing there? The whole narrative is false by default. This is in Iraq. Also, is saying that these people got familiarized with the scriptures because the Jews were telling them, hey, look at the Old Testament. You know, we are actually all sons of Abraham. And then Muhammad takes advantage of that situation. This is not the story of Muhammad. So what normally happens is we see this talking about Muhammad, we conclude this proves that the standard Islamic narrative is true, and these other details from the same source, they are wrong. Actually, they probably meant this was in Mecca. It's like, no, the source is very clear. This guy knows what happens. We take the source seriously, describes Muhammad in the way that we would expect him, but he's in a completely different region. The story is different. So in order to make this Muhammad be the correct one, we really need to ignore other sections from the story. And that's not very good. Second, the Doctrina Jacobi, everybody likes that one, says that the guy coming with the Saracens was proclaiming the advent of the Anointed One, the Christ who was to come. Muhammad didn't do that. And saying that he held the keys of paradise. Now, obviously, Muslims really do like this source, and they will try to make it fit into Muhammad, saying, okay, well, that is because reasons. They will try to explain it away. The thing is, this was not the belief of Muhammad. And also, I can't remember if this is the source that elsewhere it indicates that he is in Gaza, in a very different region. So just to prove a little bit more of this point is, this is a video I just watched the other day, and I found it to be very, very good. Obviously, I try not to put too much of things that should be unpacked in a lot of detail. But there was this video from this gentleman who obviously he's a Muslim, but he was surprisingly honest and open-minded. So I really like this video. And if you want to see a take on the existence of Muhammad from a Muslim who has clearly done his work, I recommend this video. He even will say, let's actually assume for a minute that he didn't exist, or let's assume that the tomb of Muhammad is not real, because obviously we cannot go there and dig. So let's assume that. So he is conceding things in his argumentation, which Muslims will very rarely do. So that's why I have really liked this video. But if you do watch it, notice something interesting. He will show some of these early sources, saying, you see, you have here Muhammad in these early sources, they're external. So, and he will move on very quickly because the rest of the source indicates it's not Muhammad at all, not the Muhammad of the narrative. Like he will say the one from the Tayaye, the lands in Iraq, and called MHMT, is written MHMT, and saying, you see, so that's Muhammad there, we have the source, and he moves on. We have the name, that's great, but that is in a region where Muhammad of the narrative never went. He only went as far up as Khaybar. So when we have these sources and they describe this leader who is in Syria or Iraq or in Gaza, and they still say, but it says Muhammad, so that must have been him. It's like, no, that actually tells us that it's not him, that there is more to the story. And people who have actually been following the channel for a while will know that I am of the belief that the guy who started everything was Umar, that the original, say, Muhammad or Mahmad or Mahmad or Muhammad, I don't care how you read it. The guy who actually took on that title was Umar. After all, he's the one that accomplishes something remarkable, which is conquering Jerusalem. So his story would have been told for generations to come, and easy to then twist the whole thing into a new religious figure. But anyway, when we look at the sources, the external sources, you can either A, look at the name and say, you see, that proves Muhammad, and then you have to move on very quickly, or you have to analyze the source. And when you analyze the source, you will have to dismiss all of the evidence in those sources that tells you clearly this is not the same Muhammad. Maybe it was the original Muhammad, but the stories created about him, placing him in Mecca, giving the Quran, and all of those things would be the fabrication. The stories are created because of a real guy in history doing real things, but by the time that we get to the narrative, is a different character with very different beliefs. So I hope that makes sense. Do let me know if it doesn't, or if you want to have a conversation about these things. So then we have the problem. We need to prove that Muhammad didn't exist. How can we do that? We have external sources. They're, well, credible to a degree. We don't get information from these external sources to conclude either way, only to say that they don't match the narrative. That's the maximum we can say, and it shouldn't, and it's not a deciding point. A deciding point. It can only be used compounded with a lot of other evidence. Although we can say these sources prove something was happening, but they don't prove the character of Muhammad, his beliefs, and so on. So those sources go out of the window. When we go to Islam, well, you would just have to accept them, that Muhammad is how he was described. But also that doesn't make sense, because he's described in a way that he would have not been followed by anyone. They would have forgotten about him. His arc doesn't make sense. It is full of embarrassing stories, and saying that they were not embarrassing to the people, I think is I think is not correct. So we need something. We need to pin down Muhammad to place at a time, at a source, and then attack that position. And we have it. Yay, that's nice animation there. So we have the source. It's the Quran. Every single Muslim and non-Muslim will say that the Quran is full of stories about Muhammad, with his wives, with Zayd, with in Mecca, Yathrib, Uhud, Badr, receiving the Quran. The Quran is full of stories about Muhammad. It is the earliest source. No one can deny that the Quran is the earliest source that we have. We have the manuscripts for with the stories of Muhammad. So then things get interesting when we look at what the Quran is saying about Muhammad and we see that he is not there, that those stories are not about Muhammad and they have been fabricated. So you decide if the earliest stories that we have about Muhammad in writing, agreed by every Muslim on planet Earth, if we look at those and Muhammad is not in those stories, can we at long last conclude, there you have it, he didn't exist, because the earliest source that we have is a fabrication, or his stories are fabrications. Let's explain it in this hopefully very cool manner that would make this argument very clear, hopefully. Okay, so take this as representative of the full Quran. Don't try to zoom in and read what it says. It's supposed to be gibberish. I asked ChatGPT to just create these pages. It looks like Arabic, but it's just gibberish, or it's supposed to be. So say that this is representative of the full Quran, bird's eye view of the whole Quran. And then we take our highlighter and we mark every single verse that has been exegeted as being about Muhammad. And we get something like this, right? So here we will have Muhammad in the night journey. Here we have him in Mecca. Here we have him doing this with his wives and so on. Okay, and now we know those verses are the earliest accounts of Muhammad in history that we can trust because we have the manuscripts and nobody can argue against those. And then the rest of the book will be all of the other stories. Creation, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, the famous polytheist Alexander the Great, those sort of things, right? And now we have the full Quran with the stories of Muhammad shown very clearly. So what happens if we go through those stories and we prove that they were never about Muhammad to begin with? How many of them do we need to debunk in order to conclude that Muhammad didn't exist? Because the earliest accounts that we have of him are fabrications, the ones in the Quran. What happens if we debunk that one? And then we debunk that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. What would happen? How many do we need to debunk? You have seen here on the channel, we have already discussed Surah 17, verse 1, the one about the night journey. So we are told that that verse is about Muhammad going from Mecca to Jerusalem in the Burak and that sort of thing. But when we look at the verse, we realize it has nothing to do with him. In fact, Masjid al-Aqsa was not even built at the time. We know that the story is about Moses, who is mentioned in the very next verse. So we will have all of those traditions, all of those hadiths about Muhammad doing stuff, but the source that triggered that fantasy is Moses. It was not Muhammad. They replaced him in the text, and then they wrote stories to justify that. So how many stories do we need to debunk and prove that the Muhammad in the book, that very early stories, are fabricated? Now, imagine that you have 400 stories about Muhammad or 400 verses. I don't think that you would need all 400 to be debunked to conclude that the whole thing is a fabrication. After all, they did play with the diacritics. Things were changed for a really long time. I don't think that we need to debunk every single one of them. From the Islamic narrative point of view, you only need to debunk one to prove that the whole thing is a fabrication. From, say, a different historical critique approach, you need to debunk more. But how many? Do we prove 5 verses that are meant to be about Muhammad are not about Muhammad? How about 10? How about 20? How about 50? How many verses that have been exegeted as being about Muhammad, and then we have the traditions to match. We have the traditions that explains that, and we prove that the actual source had nothing to do with Muhammad. Does that prove that Muhammad, the book came first, and then they did try to create a character, and that character had to be in the book. So they start finding verses where they can shoehorn him, and then the stories are created to match that narrative, right? So how many? Well, let's just go through some very quickly. I've discussed this many times in recent videos, so you can actually find those as well here on the channel if you want the full details. Otherwise, just wait until we go around again and I just explain everything again and again. So we have many verses that show that the guy described in the narrative who gave the book and said that he was the last prophet couldn't have existed, because the Quran says very clearly that in Surah 9, verse 31, that Allah and the Messiah are lords. That is unthinkable in Islam, hence why the translators really run away from the real meaning of this verse. Two lords, one deity, this is Christianity. It gets very, very close to Trinity. The element missing there is the Spirit, which of course is everywhere in the Quran. But this is not Islamic belief. The book was first, and the ideology appears later. To quote the great Ibn Kathir, this is not a bug, it's a feature. So the whole book is like this. The other one, the obvious one, is the verses that say that Jesus died. This is in the Quran, which contradicts Islam, proving once again that the Quran came first. It was a writing, pretty much a collection of stories, Judeo-Christian. Then they made that divine, but the book was popular. They couldn't just go and erase every single copy, so they did whatever they could. So we have Surah 355, when Allah says to Jesus, Mutawafika, I will cause you to die. And then Jesus saying death and resurrection, but the same thing appears with John the Baptist, so we don't need to delve into that one. And then Surah 517, Jesus is now in heaven speaking with Allah, saying, you caused me to die. So we have these verses which contradict Islam entirely, showing that the Quran used to be something different, and then they created the stories. In fact, they denied what the book said. We shouldn't be surprised that they tried to shoehorn Muhammad in. They tried to remove Jesus from the text as well. So we have two verses spoken pre-crucifixion, so telling the story of Jesus pre-crucifixion, and then we have one that is talking about Jesus post-crucifixion. And the verse that says they did not kill him, they did not crucify him, that is very easily explained. Like the Bible says, Jesus said, nobody can take my life from me. I lay down of my own accord. And in the very next chapter, he is killed. And no one says, hang on a minute, you see a contradiction in the Bible. He said nobody could take his life, and then he dies, right? It's like, no, it's not a contradiction. We know exactly what it means, that he was the perfect sacrifice. He had to sacrifice his life. So when these three verses, in conjunction with the one that says that they didn't kill him, they were told to the public, they understood what it means. They didn't kill him. The divine nature was unharmed. You cannot kill the divine nature. So what did they kill? That thing that is translated as the shadow is like the icon, is like what you can see. But what they didn't crucify is what you cannot see, what is inside. So people would have understood it. It's funny how nowadays every single Muslim will know about that verse, and they will say, you see, Jesus didn't die. But these ones, which are very clearly saying that Jesus dies, they don't know about this. When they will go to Ibn Kathir, who appears 700 years after Muhammad, to say that this means, oh, he fell asleep or he was taken, is like, dude, every Arabic speaker knows exactly the meaning of the words. And this is exactly what it says. According to their own sources, we go to Corpus Quran, and this verb in this form, every single time means death. Every single time, no exceptions in the Quran, except when it comes to Jesus. When it comes to Jesus, as if by magic, it means that he was taken up or he was raised. It's like, no, it actually means exactly the same that you have everywhere. So we know the book told one story, and then they covered up everything the book said in order to build their own ideology. Where do you think they stopped? Do you think they stopped at saying, okay, so we're going to say that Jesus didn't die. We're going to make up a different meaning of this word. Do you think they stopped there? No, they didn't. They carried on. They did the same thing by putting Muhammad in many verses. Another verse that I'm playing with quite a lot these days. So again, it's still the same. 355, Allah is saying to Jesus, I will make those who follow you superior to those who disbelieve until the day of resurrection. This is a very clear verse, and it tells you the whole theme of the Quran before they started trying to twist the meaning, right? This is what it was. We've seen the map of Christendom. You couldn't say this and then 5 minutes later say, no, but the Christians who actually are in most of the known world now, they are all wrong following Paul. It's like, no. People knew what this means. And also, this is supposed to be spoken, and then a few years later, they conquered Jerusalem. So these people are very well acquainted as to what the meaning of this verse is. But remember this, those who follow Jesus will be superior to those who disbelieve until the day of resurrection. That's quite the statement. We go to Surah 58, verse 22. We have then here, blah, 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 those who oppose Allah and his messenger. Okay, so the moment that we read that, what do we say? That's Muhammad. Of course, look, Allah and his messenger, it has to be Muhammad. It's always Muhammad, and it is exegeted in that manner. And then he's saying a number of things, and then talks about those who followed Allah and his messenger. And look at those. Look at this. So those he has decreed within their hearts faith and supported them with a spirit from him. The messenger here is not Muhammad, it's Jesus. Those who followed him supported with a spirit from God. You see, the theme is just right there. But you see the deception. They tell us, no, you see, every time he says the messenger, that's our guy, that's our guy, that's our guy. Why? Can you read the text? It says that those with him were given the spirit. This is a Christian statement. And look how it ends. Those are the successful. We have seen in Surah 355, the Quran saying, those who follow Jesus will be the uppermost until the day of judgment. It should surprise no one that this verse, when it's saying who are the successful, we haven't moved from Christians to Muslims. We are still with Christians. Allah and his messenger is how they are describing Jesus. And those with him supported with the Spirit. These are the apostles and the followers of the way. It's right there in very clear Arabic. Then another one, which I actually like to use now more and more. Surah 48, verse 9. So in here we have Allah and his Rasul, once again. Of course, that has to be exegeted as is Muhammad, is Muhammad, is Muhammad. But there are three words that appear immediately after. And because of Arabic grammar, that means that these three are meant to be about the Rasul. But look at how deceitful. So let's actually look at ChatGPT or Grok, or one of the two. I can't remember, that actually translated this. And let me just change this a little bit so that you can read it a bit better. There you go. So, literal rendering from ChatGPT. So that you believe in Allah and his messenger, and you support him and you honor him and you glorify him morning and evening. This is a Christian statement. After the messenger, it tells you support him, honor him, glorify him morning and evening. A Christian would have no problem with this. But because this is taken from Christians, and now they are trying to shoehorn Muhammad into this verse, making the Rasul be Muhammad, we have a problem. Because in the new ideology they build, you cannot glorify the prophet. You cannot glorify anyone but God. In Christianity, no problem. Everyone will know who the Rasul is, and it's not Muhammad. When we look at the tafsir, we see how they try to fix it. They make the first two about Muhammad, support him and revere him. And by the time that we get to the third sentence, to the third part, is pronounce Allah's purity morning and evening. There is no Allah in there. That's why Daif International has to insert the prophet to make an actual clean break and spell out that the next bit is about Allah. But this is not what the Arabic says. These are the sort of things that we find throughout the Quran everywhere, where the messenger is very clearly, very overtly Jesus. But they have exegeted that as Muhammad, and they have now been pushing it down our throats for over 1,000 years. This is not true. The Arabic is clear. All of those words are for the messenger, and only Jesus fits that description. Right? Next. And I think this is probably the last one. Let me just double check. Before we get there. Oh yeah, almost the last one. There will be just one more after this. Surah 7 verses 157 and 158 give the game away entirely. And you can see the problem that this verse causes to this day. Surah 757 is one of the verses that triggers the Islamic dilemma. It's the one that says that the messenger, let's exegete it as Muhammad as usual, is in the Torah and the Injil. And because he's not in the Torah and the Injil, then Muslims will say, oh, well, you see, you've corrupted your scriptures. That argument appears in the 10th century, by the way. Christians then tell them the Quran affirms the Torah and the Injil. But the problem is here. The problem is here that we have exegeted a verse about Jesus as being about Muhammad. There is no Muhammad in this verse. There has never been a Muhammad in this verse. Who is the messenger who is in the Torah and the Injil? It is Jesus, period. And these people would know. The word unlettered, that is still getting people saying, but it says unlettered. Jesus was not unlettered. It doesn't mean unlettered. This is part of the deception. The word in here is ummi. It is only because of the traditions that now we read ummi as illiterate. It is not true. Even Rashad Khalifa says it doesn't mean unlettered. He still exegetes this as being about Muhammad, but he says it doesn't say, it doesn't mean unlettered. It means Gentile. And then Rashad Khalifa says, goes on to prove that Muhammad was literate, right? And he then attacks every single Islamic scholar who says that he was illiterate. This is part of the cope. They've taken a word that doesn't mean unlettered, and they have made it mean unlettered to fit a narrative. So please don't comment to say, but Jesus was not unlettered. It doesn't mean unlettered. It's part of the lie. Murad translates this as the national prophet, or the prophet to the nations, or something like this. So, which there is a link to the Old Testament and things like that. So it's very cool. Anyway, you can just see through the description that this will be, again, the messenger, and it would be Jesus, who is in the Torah and the Injil. This is not Muhammad telling people, I'm in the Torah and the Injil, in lands which had been very clearly Christianized. That is insane. He wouldn't get away with it. And his followers would know. They had heard these stories countless times. They would know Jews and Christians, plenty of them. This verse is insane. It's insane and it's stupid that it would ever be about Muhammad. He would be found out immediately. But the description of it, it describes Jesus. He's in the Torah and the Injil, and then who enjoys upon them what is right and forbids them what is wrong, and makes lawful for them the good things and prohibits for them the evil. Fun fact, according to Islam, only God can make things lawful and unlawful. This verse says very clearly that the messenger makes things lawful and unlawful. It could not be Muhammad. Another fun fact, the Quran says elsewhere, guess who makes things lawful and unlawful? Jesus. Surah 3, verse 50. And I have come, that's Jesus speaking, confirming what was before me of the Torah. Great. Oh, the Torah. And he's in the Torah and the Injil, you see? And to make lawful for you some of what was forbidden to you. This will have to be exegeted as, well, God told him. The verse very clearly says that Jesus makes things lawful and unlawful. And not only in one place, in two places. Surah 757 says that as well. I can be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. I think these are the only two statements in the Quran where someone makes things lawful and unlawful. There are a couple of verses that says things like people made things lawful according to their desires. That is actually criticizing people for making things halal or haram. But this is people just saying, no, you cannot do this, you can do this. It is not a command from the heavens as to what is lawful and unlawful. It is people making that decision. But tell me if I'm wrong, and there are any verses in the Quran, any other verses where there is someone, Moses or Muhammad or whoever, making things lawful and unlawful. I think it is only these two. I'm happy to stand corrected. Please let me know. As it stands, let's just go with only two verses in the Quran says that someone makes something lawful and unlawful, and in both cases is very clearly Jesus. Then we continue with the verse. And the messenger relieves them of their burden and the shackles which were upon them. I fail to see how Muhammad would be doing that. But in the case of Jesus, let's read the same theme in Matthew 11. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Even the whole theme about burdens, we have it in the Bible about Jesus. And then it gets so much worse. Immediately after, it says, so they who have believed in him, honored him, supported him. Remember that theme before about supporting the prophet, the messenger, the Rasul, and so on? Same thing in here. And we've shown that the previous one had to be about Jesus. And then it goes and followed, in the past tense, the light which was sent down with him. This is insane. If you go to the tafsir, the light is exegeted as the Quran. And it's like, first of all, it's not a light, it is a book. Second of all, the Quran keeps saying that Allah is the light and lots of other things like that, which creates a problem. Also, the light was never sent down. If the Quran had been sent, okay, at no point during the life of Muhammad, according to the narrative, you could say that the Quran was sent down in the past tense. It was always in the process of being sent down. So you would need to really play with the meaning of this and say, well, it means the sections that had been sent up to that point, and those people in the past, it starts to fall to pieces. This is talking in the past tense. People who followed the light, which was sent down with him, which, at least in English, if in Arabic is different, let me know in the comment section. But at least in English, is very clear that if the light was sent down with him, it really implies that he was up above. And now that we know who the messenger is, anyone reading this at the time or listening to this narration would have understood that him being sent down is the word of God, and the light sent down with him would be the Spirit, or vice versa, you know? And what does it say? Remember Surah 3, verse 55, those who follow Jesus will be the successful. How does it end? It is those who will be the successful. It is the same statement. When we get to the next verse, we get the confirmation enhanced once again. This say, I have unpacked that with Lloyd, Odon, Usama, and Adam Seeker. So we do have the problems with the whole say, is entire cope, and they didn't even know which ones meant say and which ones meant he said. Just to illustrate a point, and without delving into this in detail, we've done it in other shows. If this was originally read, he said, as there was the confusion about this word. If it was he said, look what happens. He said, "O mankind, indeed I am the messenger, the messenger of Allah to you all, to whom belongs the dominion of the heavens and the earth." This would be Jesus speaking. Everybody would understand it in that manner. The previous verse is talking about the messenger. It describes Jesus. Those who follow him will be the successful, as we've seen in Surah 355. It continues then with someone speaking. The only person that is discussed in these verses is Jesus. These would be words from Jesus, saying that he's the messenger, as previously stated, to whom belong the dominions of the heavens and the earth. You see how then they try to exegete that by saying, no, this to whom belongs the dominion, I'm the messenger of Allah, so the dominion of the heavens and the earth is of Allah, that's what it means. This had a very different meaning. And the final bit, we have, I believe that these are two very clear parallel statements. The first one says, believe in Allah, and then his messenger, the Ummi Prophet. So that is the first argument, and then the second argument, and the instruction of belief. And then it tells you what happens to those who believe in the same people that have been discussed. The first one being Allah, and you have him here, who believes in Allah, that's fine. And then the second section, his messenger, the Ummi Prophet. In here, we have his words in plural. But in the Rasam, it doesn't say that. When this was written, it didn't say, at the moment it says kalimatihi, but the reason that is plural is because a dagar aleph was added to make it plural. The dagar aleph is inserted much later. Without it, this would have been read kalimatihi in the singular. So it would be, believe in Allah and his messenger, the Ummi Prophet, who believes in Allah and his word, meaning the word is the Ummi Prophet, as seen in many other places in the Quran, as in the word being Jesus. And then, and follow him who? His word, that you may be guided. The theme is everywhere. And these, I think these two verses are some that expose the fabrication really, really well. They create the Islamic dilemma. You can very easily show how it has nothing to do with Muhammad, but Jesus. When you look at the historical context where these things were written, you know no one could get away with it. It's describing the spirit, and there are the parallels with other verses in the Quran, making sure that you understand that this is Jesus. But they fabricated Muhammad and they put him into the book. So, as I asked before, how many verses do we need to show that it's not Muhammad in the text before we can conclude that the whole thing is fabrication? They begin with the book. The book is talking primarily about Jesus, and they shoehorn Muhammad wherever they can. And they create hadiths and obviously tafsir to put Muhammad in that text. And that's only the ones that we can work out. There will be lots of other verses that were inserted late, that there were interpolations to really put Muhammad into the text. Although at this point, I'm inclined to think that there isn't a lot of interpolation going on. Okay, that's just my 2 pence, but we will see. Another very clear problem is that much of the Quran could not be read, certainly not in a standard way. You had to add the dots and dashes. The harakat, the hamzas are introduced late as well. So up to that point, you have hundreds of years where people are trying to read the rasam in a way that is beneficial to their ideology, to this fabrication. So they really try. So in order for us to go through that rasam and reverse engineer it to go back to a version that makes sense, it will be possible, and we've done it with many verses. The chances are we will not be able to do it with all of the verses because we will not even know if the words that were originally in there, they were Arabic to begin with, or if they were copied from other traditions. These people, after all, they were bilingual and they had influences from many, many different traditions. So, but we can unpack a lot. And I think it is very clear that they shoehorn Muhammad into the book. They tried to replace Jesus, sometimes Moses, and so on. Then they created the traditions to justify that further. But we can certainly prove that he was not in many, many of these verses of the Quran. And I think that should be the conclusion, that therefore Muhammad didn't exist. He was fabricated late and imposed onto the text. If he did exist and he gave this book, remember, this book said that Jesus died. Actually, this book affirms the Trinity and so on. Therefore, the Muhammad who gave this book to the world was not a Muslim. As we've shown many times before, the bottom layer is very clear and it has nothing to do with Islam. It says that Jesus died and resurrected. It says that Jesus is God. That's why they call him the Word of God, and why you have to follow him, and why you have to honor him, as we've seen in Surah, whatever it was, I forgot, just 3 slides ago. It affirms the Trinity. And the Quran has no idea about a guy called Muhammad walking around in Mecca. That's why Muhammad only appears 4 times. 2 of those are in the past tense, and Mecca is only mentioned once. It's because those things are mistranslations when they were forcing a reading into the text. Nothing to do with Muhammad. So that's the bottom layer. That's the origins of the book. The top layer, we read this and it's just reading tafsir. It's all about Muhammad. Jesus is not God. It denies the Trinity, and the Quran is all of a sudden an actual revelation, which the Quran doesn't know about. Anyway, so we've discussed these things many, many, many times, and there will be more being discussed in the near future. But for now, we can just call it a day. So, what do you guys think? Do you think, after looking at the map and seeing a little bit of what would have happened on day 1 of Islam, do you think that these people were hardcore believers of this new faith, even though they didn't have the traditions yet? And they were actually writing the stories about a prophet who they really liked, they really believed in him, and they wrote down those horrible stories because they really like him, but that described him. Trust me, bro. Do you think that that is plausible even? Or it is more plausible that the people who wrote those embarrassing stories, they did so because they wanted you to know in the future that these people should not be followed. Obviously, what happened as a result is that people were made to not read hadiths, just to follow their imams blindly, which contradicts Surah 9, verse 31, if you think about it. And they just kept Muslims in the dark. And now reaching the 21st century, where Christian apologists show those sources to Muslims for the first time in 1,000 years, and they are horrified by them. So let me know if you think that it is possible that we had some very brave spies infiltrating the the caliphate or working with the caliphate and making all of these embarrassing stories possible. So that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure that you subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any further thoughts or evidence in any direction about this discussion, let me know in the comments section below and I will pick it up. So I hope you have a nice week ahead and hopefully we will see you all soon. God bless you all. Bye-bye.
There is only one Quran, right? Every Quran in the world is the same. That's what you've been told. You have been told a lie!
Quran talks about 26 of the Quran.
26 different Quran!
There are 0 Dawa guys apparently left on the planet who are willing to defend Muhammad in a debate.
Everybody can go and read it. This is a book full of mistakes in Arabic, in the grammar, in the spelling, in the pronunciation.
Whoever wrote the Quran made an error because they didn't quite understand what was written in the 7th century in the Torah and the Injil.
Stay away from these translations. They are propaganda.
We know that stories about Muhammad were made up on an industrial scale.
What in the world is this Injil?